Good afternoon and hello. Welcome to the third episode of Perspectives on Sustainable Development. I am Chris Whitehead, your host, and today we are honored to be joined by a good friend of ours, Dr. Ken Richards, of the tenured professor at the University of Indiana. Dr. Richards, how are you doing?
Doing well. Thanks a lot for having me.
Absolutely. Happy to have you on. And I was kind of joking with Dr. Richards before this. I first got to know Ken through a project I was starting to put together in South Jersey and Philadelphia on cumulative impacts. I got to talking about the social cost of carbon, but we'll get into all that in a little bit. Um, the first episode we've done here to date was on climate change. Obviously, massive, important topic. The second one we did was one close to my heart on environmental justice. Again, hugely important topic. So I wanted to bring everyone here today, someone who actually acts on policy and is brought in around the world to help put policy together based on sound economic planning. And if you want to actually have an effort in this and affect something, what are the types of things you have to start thinking about? So I know it's a lofty introduction there, but Dr. Richards, can you just tell us a little bit about how you first got into this work?
Well, sure. It actually, I have to admit, it goes all the way back to childhood. My father was a botanist, and I used to follow him around in the field. He was a taxonomist, and I told him what he did was incredibly boring, identifying plants, and yet it exposed me to lots of time in the woods and tide pools, and kind of wondering, well, what could we do with this that would both preserve the environment and serve people. And I've always had that kind of an inclination toward this. My undergraduate studies were in actually in botany and chemistry. But during that process, I realized I wasn't cut out for laboratory work. And I had a fascinating class from a civil engineer on coastal zone management. I thought that is really interesting. And so I went on and started a second bachelor's degree in civil engineering. I had a professor who came along and told me, "You don't want to be an engineer." I said, "No, I'm pretty sure I do. I'm working awfully hard at this." And he said, "No, no, you want to be closer to the decision makers." I said, "Well, compared to a botanist, an engineer is close to decision makers." So now
Like,
you want to either be an economist or a lawyer. And he said, I'll help you get your master's degree in planning if you promise to go on for a terminal degree. And I said, well, okay. So I got both a bachelor's and a master's degree in civil engineering with an emphasis in planning and environmental engineering. And then because he had been so good to me, I actually completed both of those promises. I went on to get a PhD in public policy and essentially applied economics and a JD in law, which is all by way of saying that I've had a rather undirected approach to the topic, but it's always been about environment, our relation to the environment, technologies and environment, um, and uh, the other part of that is I've always had an engineer's approach to public policy. I've learned the lessons of economics without actually becoming an economist. And I think that's a real accomplishment.
no, that's a very, very interesting perspective to come from, and I think very valuable for the work that you do. And something that you said hit home with me in a lot of ways that once you find something that you're passionate about and you want to keep learning more on, you just keep developing and keep pushing yourself. And it seems every time I talk to you, you're traveling to some foreign country, Malaysia, and all these other like huge projects being brought in by foreign governments to help them scope environmental models. Can you talk quickly as to the types of things you have to first think about before even trying to start that conversation?
Sure. The very first thing we think about when we're contemplating a project in another country is who are we going to work with locally? I very, very seldom go into a country without a local partner. I think it's essential to understand the context. And the reason is because we're not working with abstract tools in a general environment. We're taking policy instruments, specific tools, and applying them in a highly constrained environment. If you don't understand the constraints, then it may be that you'll be entirely frustrated in first in choosing policy instruments, and second in designing or implementing those. So we always look for really good local partners, and we've been blessed with tremendous partners in virtually every country that we've worked in.
That's really interesting. And is it generally a specific ask that you're brought in for, or is it kind of more along the lines of, Dr. Richards, I know I want to do something here, but I don't know exactly what or how. Come help.
Yeah, well, it varies, but mostly it's quite specific.
Okay.
So just to give an example, South Africa had implemented a carbon tax, and they now wanted to add on a carbon offset provision to that carbon tax. And an important part of adding carbon credits for carbon offsets is what standard are they going to be certified under? And they wanted to have a process for selecting those standards. Now, that might sound like a really small focus or fine focus, but in fact, it took in the full breadth of the carbon tax, because what kinds of projects, what rigor in project analysis you require, all of that is tied to the carbon tax itself. And so we found ourselves in South Africa working with a very broad range of stakeholders. We've done similarly in Malaysia, where they didn't have a carbon price yet, but they were examining that, and in parallel, they wanted to look at carbon offsets. So we're working with another team there as two teams in parallel, and we have to constantly be aware of what the other one is doing. So that one was a little more general. Costa Rica, they just said, we want a carbon price. And as we got into it, we started to realize how constrained that decision was. And we went from a carbon price to an emissions levy that covered not only carbon dioxide, but local pollutants as well, PM 2.5, SOx, NOx, and carbon monoxide. So it varies, but we're always trying to pay attention to what do they really need. And sometimes that means helping them redefine the question.
And for those who don't actually understand this or who aren't aware of our background, I think Dr. Richards was just speaking to me a little bit there, because he knows I am extremely passionate about various local impacts, and that kind of was going to go on the next question I was going to have, that a lot of the economic pricing models that you see out there speak of carbon taxes and seem to focus on climate change, but not as many, or you don't hear as much rather about the local impacts and the things that could affect childhood asthma rates and things very close to home. How do you focus or build something out that can do both, affect locally, but also have climate change impacts?
Yeah, oh, that's a great question. Going on with the Costa Rica example, which was a wonderful project, they had said, well, we just want to know the economic effects of this carbon price and how much will it reduce carbon emissions. So that was the starting point. But we said, well, if you're going to adopt a carbon price, understand that means that households are going to have to pay for that. So you might want to ask how this tax burden will fall across different income levels. And we were able to model then what we call the distributional effect of the carbon tax, and say, here's how much it will affect spending in low-income houses, and you break up the household income levels by decile. So the lowest 10%, the next 10%, the highest 10%. And so you can say, this is how it will affect each. That then invites the government to consider, do we need to compensate low-income households for this new economic burden? And what kind of policy design would help us address that? Now, the second thing we did that they didn't ask for, but we felt was essential, is that we developed a model of the health effects of reducing emissions, because San Jose is a very congested metropolitan area, and they worry a lot about air quality. And so we were able to demonstrate that the health effects of the proposed emissions levy was actually, the health effects, the benefits, were going to be greater than the amount of revenue that they raised. And they were so excited about that element that they could actually point to this and say, good for the environment, good for our health, and some more revenue for the government.
Now that's interesting too, though, because almost everything I've read has said that various carbon taxes are actually regressive and impact lower incomes more. So yeah, it would make sense to have that type of subsidy in place. But then also, can you speak a little bit, I guess, about how we quantify health benefits, and is it difficult at times, I guess, for lack of a better term, to get people to fully understand the economic and actual tangible health benefits that are going to be realized over longer term time scales, because it's not present today.
Yeah, absolutely. So there are various levels of sophistication in how we do that modeling. The one in Costa Rica was done on a very limited budget and in a rather tight time frame. So what we did there was to first adapt an EPA model. It's called the MOVES model, which is a wondrously complex and abstract piece of work. And we adapted that model for Costa Rica by saying, San Jose is a bit like Dade County in terms of their weather patterns, their climate, and so on. So from that, we were able to simulate how much emissions would be reduced. Then you go from that physical part to the health effects. For that, we had to borrow a model from IMF. They had a general model that they used to look at the health effects of various kinds of environmental taxes, and so we adapted that. Is it highly precise? No, but it's a good first step. And it allows us to say, it looks like the health effects are going to be significant. And if you want something more precise, it's an invitation. We thought of it as a sort of an order of magnitude, a screening tool, one that says, pay attention to this issue. It looks like it's going to be a big deal.
Yeah.
How do you communicate that? That goes into the whole stakeholder process, and there are so many tools out there for how you engage the public, how you engage specific groups of stakeholders. It's an art in itself. I should also say it's also an academic field, but it's not my specialty. But I do I do recognize that a very important part of talking about that carbon tax or emissions levy in the case of Costa Rica was going to be, what are the health effects? How can we relate this to something people understand?
Yeah.
So people don't understand PM 2.5. They don't understand NOx, but they understand asthma. And if you can relate it to something they understand and say there will be this many fewer cases of asthma, this many fewer visits to the emergency room for pulmonary reasons, and so on. And the big one, of course, this many fewer deaths
Yeah.
because of this.
Absolutely. And that goes into a lot of the types of work that I do, as you know. And it's interesting because I've been trying to spend a lot of my time over the last couple of years trying to instill some basic tenets on stakeholder engagement to industry. And a lot of companies I've been working with have been doing portions of this already, but haven't formalized it. They didn't have plans in place. But this honestly boils down to being genuine whenever humanly possible, understanding who you're working with, and just what I like to call objective transparency. No industrial site is gonna get things right all the time. Everyone has problems, but I think it's a matter of showing, okay, this is what we're doing right now. These are what our impacts are. This is how we're trying to improve. And just showing that effort over time, I think buys a lot of goodwill. But it takes investment and being willing to actually be there the longer term. And that's what I think some have trouble with.
Yeah. Yeah. The trust element is essential in that process. Now, I'm mostly like an economist, and I don't wander into the psychology, the sociology side so much, but just in practical experience, one of the things I've observed as I go into a new country, there's an enormous amount of skepticism, and it's not undeserved. It's not it's based on experience. It's a lot of skepticism, and a lot of what we do in the early part of the project is to build trust, and that includes giving people usable information, taking time to hear and then hear what their concerns are, explain concepts that will help them understand the broader context, make them better at their jobs. And what I have found over time is that it is possible to build trust in my case with a new government.
Sure.
But it is essential, and it can be kind of hard work.
And that's a good segue actually too. And the area I was going to ask you next. You've been doing this for quite a while. Oftentimes going back to the same country a couple of times, a couple of different projects. How has your work progressed over the years, and what changes have you actually seen in, again, I don't know if this is the right term to use or not, fighting climate change? Have there
Yeah.
been models put forward that have been successful? Are there things you could think of that haven't worked, and any lessons learned you could possibly cherry pick from those experiences?
Yeah, let me think about that a bit. The first thing I would say is when we come from a Western setting under, say, a international financial institution like the World Bank or ABD, sort of choosing and sponsoring us, paying for the costs of the project, it might be easy to think, oh, there's the experts going to the country. They're going to have to tone down everything they say. And that just isn't the case. I have been
Agreed.
so impressed with the skill, the knowledge, the training of my counterparts, even in developing countries. And so the first thing I've learned is that I can count on the people in country to pull their weight, to ask really good questions, and to work hard at understanding what we're doing. And I seldom make a recommendation where I go, this is what you need to do. What I do instead is say, you have some options. Here are the pros and cons. And then let them do the really hard work of saying, in this context, here's the right choice.
Hmm.
And that brings me to the second point in carbon pricing, which is about 50% of the work that the team I work with, 50% of our work is probably on carbon pricing. There are two dominant instruments. There's carbon taxes and emissions trading systems.
Mm-hmm.
And people talk about, oh, should we do an ETS or a carbon price? Carbon price, ETS. And my response is that there's more within group variation than between group variation. In other words, a carbon tax is not a carbon tax. It's not, there is so much variation in the way countries have adopted carbon taxes. To say, oh, they have a carbon tax, technically, yes, but to think then you understand what they're doing because they have a carbon tax, that's just not the case. And so when you choose a carbon tax, you've only done the very first step. The hard work is all of the subsequent decisions you have to make. First, what's the levy going to be? That is, what is the tax rate? Is it going to have a trajectory, or is it going to be constant? Who are we going to cover? What gases will we cover? What exemptions will we provide? What will we do with the revenue? Who's going to administer the carbon? And it goes on and on and on. And the same thing with an ETS. ETS may have even more variables in it.
Sure.
So the one of those things is, just don't think that it's a simple choice between carbon taxes and ETS if you're going for a price-based instrument.
That's interesting. And it got me thinking too of the last COP. And obviously a lot of interesting things happened also about 100,000 people attended, which was kind of crazy. But one of the big things that came out of it was the establishment of a loss and damages plan. And the first thing I thought of, Dr. Richards is going to have a lot of work to do, him and his buddies going forward over the next couple of years, because it's just the complexity involved in something like that. Could one land or one type of tax or levy ever work? I would think not. It would have to fall to each country, or even further than that, to how they want to try to adhere actually adhere to this, right?
Yeah. So the thing to understand is that the loss and damage fund is not a policy instrument in the typical sense. It is more of a compensation approach in which the industrialized countries set aside money that will go to the countries most affected by climate change. And in that sense, it's not really designed to change behavior. It's not designed to improve decisions. It really is more of a compensatory tool. But even that demonstrates the complexity of these kinds of international decisions. So, for example, the first question: who should administer the fund? Now, the World Bank was proposed as the administrator of the fund, but there were countries that objected to that. The World Bank is too bureaucratic. The World Bank will apply the same rules to giving the fund proceeds to countries as they do to making loans, and they don't give my country enough. What will qualify a country for receipt from the fund? who's going to contribute to the fund? Everyone's quite happy to say, oh, we'll contribute. But the record on these sorts of things is the promises vastly exceed the actual contributions.
Yeah, it's a pretty
So
horrible record, actually.
yeah, it is. And so we you as you think about implementing something like that, you have to think carefully about all of the elements that go into it. And it's very easy for these programs to become so burdened by their own procedures that they don't actually accomplish much of anything. And there are some donor countries looking at this going, they're not horrible, or they're not miserly. They just look at this and go, we don't think it's going to be effective, so we don't want to put money into it.
No, and that makes a
And
lot of sense. Apologize for cutting you off there, but that makes a lot of sense just because of the amount of parties that are involved, and each has their own domestic interests. Obviously, each has their own constraints and concerns. So I just got to thinking too about, the challenge in front of us, the climate impacts piling up. Very few people now will debate that, but if we're on the bad trajectory that the modeling says we're on, and we're just objectively looking at building out a mechanism here to compensate people for these types of impacts, isn't this behind the eight ball a little bit?
oh, sure. It's interesting in some ways how naive we've been from the beginning. So I had the privilege of attending the first international gathering of the IPCC Working Group 3. This is back in 1989, just after George Bush Sr. had been elected. And all of these countries came together to talk about, well, what can be done, what policies should we adopt, what will it cost, who will bear the burden. And it was an interesting exercise in international mismanagement of diplomacy because the U.S. was hosting it. James Baker gave his inaugural speech as the Secretary of Treasury, and what wasn't apparent at the opening, but quickly became apparent, is the U.S. had wired the entire gathering to make sure that no substantive decisions were made. So all the speakers were going to be from the U.S. Or the U.K., which at that point in time was closely aligned with the U.S. I was watching, so I was just a grad student who happened to have a year to spend in the government. But I was watching this as it developed. And I thought, oh, this is not going to go well. They're going to get hammered for doing this. And sure enough, on the first day, somebody from Australia stood up and said, this is outrageous. This is the stupidest thing I've ever seen. You've just invited your friends to give talks. There's nothing substantive. And the whole thing fell apart.
Wow.
On the first morning of the meeting. And they were scrambling. What can we do? What can we do? But that was the kind of naivety that we entered into this with. And, there are any number of sort of patterns that you see repeated over and over again that I don't know if it's a generational thing. We need to learn them every 10 or 15 years, or if we just haven't really learned those lessons. But the one that we do seem to have sorted out is that in the early going, during the 90s, it was virtually verboten to talk about adaptation. No one was allowed to raise adaptation at meetings, gatherings, government meetings, or more public, and say, we need to talk about adaptation to climate change, because that would be like conceding that we're not going to beat climate change. And then I'm not sure exactly when it was, but I'm going to say sometime between 2000 and 2005, the willingness to start talking about adaptation started creeping in to the discussions. And then by 2010, it was a major element of the international discussions. How will we adapt?
That's really interesting in a lot of levels, but if you just step back and think about that, the Earth is the biggest complex intertwined system that there is. And you start messing with the climate, everything below is going to be changed. I mean, it's just only logical. So it's a little naive, arrogant, whichever word you want to say, that anyone could ever fully control that. In my opinion, it's really just uh actually risk analysis. And as things things go on, I'm sorry, rather, things get riskier, more expensive, more impactful. And is that a world we want to be living in?
Right, right. An anthropologist friend of mine described, I think he might have been the first person to describe climate change as a wicked problem. And that means that it has certain attributes. And essentially, a wicked problem is one that we have trouble defining what the problem itself is, and we have values entwined in all of the solutions. And there's many people trying to make the decision, in this case, an entire globe. And so this all comes together. The uncertainty, the very long time periods involved, the irreversibility of the consequences, and the fact that you've got to get everybody on board. That is, no single country can do anything about this, and not even China or the U.S. acting alone is going to substantially alter the pathway. And so it is truly a wicked problem.
That's funny though. What that made me think of, and you might actually relate to this. I married a girl from Massachusetts, so everything is wicked. That's her favorite. That's her
Yeah.
favorite phrase.
This is a slightly more precise use of the word wicked.
But the story I brought up also made me think of one of the what's I would say widely accepted most successful environmental policies of all time. Actually, Montreal Protocol came out around the same time, a couple years earlier. What was it about that one, in your opinion, that had everyone jump on board and said, "Okay, we actually have to do something about this"?
Well, that's interesting. I don't know all the details, but there are two elements that stand out to me about the Montreal Protocol and why that was possible. The first was, first of all, the discussions about the ozone layer had been going on for a while. There was a recognition that we needed to, but then there was a British study that emerged just about the time that they were heading into the Montreal Protocol or Montreal round of discussions. I think it was just about that time that demonstrated very clearly that the ozone layer had been damaged significantly. And so this was, we sometimes talk about the smoking gun. This was the thing they looked at and said, oh, this is serious. We need to do something about this. So that was the first thing. Second thing is that DuPont, the largest manufacturer of CFCs, came out and said, yeah, we need to do this.
That's interesting.
And then I said there were two, there were actually three. And the third one is what got the US in on this. So we were talking earlier about the economic analysis, cost benefit analysis and such. And there's, one of the things I tell my students about cost benefit analysis is that you're just informing a discussion. You are not making a decision with this cost benefit analysis. In fact, it's virtually unheard of for a cost benefit analysis by itself to cause a decision to go in a particular direction. It's usually just an element of the decision, with one exception. And that was when EPA put down a cost benefit analysis of the banning chlorofluorocarbons and the health effects, the health benefits that would have. That went into an interagency meeting and and sort of said, here's our analysis. Of course, it sent it out ahead of the meeting. And so any number of other departments and agencies were ready to jump on it and criticize it. And then somebody from the Council of Economic Advisors said, wait a minute. Do you see what the benefit cost ratio is here? It's 10 to 1. It doesn't matter if they got this thing or that thing a little bit wrong. We never see that kind of benefit cost ratio. This is a no-brainer. We have to do this.
Interesting.
And that was the decision that came out of the US.
Wow. Okay. So I gotta say, you gotta leave it to the economists to boil things down to points we can understand. I appreciate that. I'll take one on my money any day.
I should say that there's a little more behind the DuPont announcement as well.
Okay.
Which is DuPont was one of the major producers of CFCs. But if you ban CFCs, you need a replacement. They were the only producers of the replacement.
Sure.
They had a virtual monopoly on the replacements. So it was no skin off their nose if their product was banned, because they would just be able to make it up with the next best product.
And so that is a variation of a story I've heard a few times. And my first impression is, I understand that that's business, but it's also better for the environment the next time around. But then how many times have we done that over the course of our history, that what's fine and acceptable one period for 10 years or so, 20 years, all of a sudden, wait a minute, how the heck were we doing that this whole time? We have to go clean all that stuff up, start again, and here's a better alternative. Kind of feels like we've done that a few times already.
Yeah.
Interesting. All right, so you told us a couple of things as to how you start putting together these economic models for various countries, various things you have to think about, but you still haven't given an example of a plan or a certain project that just went absolutely right. Like, this one was good. This did exactly what we wanted it to do. This met all of our objectives. This is still working and adapting 10 years later, what the case could be. Is there anything like that actually jumps out?
Yeah. So that goes to the issue of how quickly do things change. And so in terms of really being out there and moving things along, we started with my current team, we started in 2016, developing a carbon tax guide for the World Bank. That then got us into more specific applications in various countries. The probably the best example of a keeper, so to speak, is the South Africa project, and even that hasn't come fully to fruition yet. So we did our analysis in 2020. It was done really quite quickly. uh, 11 months for a project that size was pretty quick, particularly considering we tested the framework that we developed for them. It was relatively complex. We developed tools to help them administer the framework, and so on. They then had to put that out for public comment.
Mm.
And that process took another couple of years. Then they had to make some revisions in response to those comments. And I understand that finally now in early 2024, it's shown up in their, it's called the public budget, but it's more than that. It's sort of a roadmap for what the coming year has. It's now in there, and they say that they're ready to adopt it. Now, if they adopt it, we'll be, of course, delighted. But that's only the start. Then the question is, will any new standards be approved under this framework? Will they actually implement it in a meaningful way? It'll be another 2 years until we even get a first feedback on that. So think about, that's 6 years that it takes. So this is not a game for the impatient. And unfortunately, an awful lot of people think I'm going to get in and get out very quickly. I have friends in this field that have been working on it for literally for decades. I'm thinking of a friend of mine, Suzanne Ackerfeld from Sweden. She's with the Sweden Ministry of Finance, was involved in developing the EU ETS. She thinks a lot about carbon taxes, has been involved in the Sweden carbon tax, and now is very much involved in the carbon border adjustment mechanism known as CBAM that they're talking about adding on. But think about that. She's been doing this since the early 90s, and she's now seeing kind of the mature system. How many years later? 30 years later. It takes time for these things to develop.
Yeah.
And it's one of the challenges is we can't, in carbon taxes as an example, we can't say, hey, let's do some studies of how effective carbon taxes have been. There haven't been enough of them. There haven't been enough years of carbon taxes to actually say what effect they've had.
Oh, that's really
so
interesting.
We can observe, we can make casual observations, but doing rigorous statistical analysis has proven really challenging. There have been a few that tend to concentrate on Sweden, Norway, others that have been in place for quite a long time.
Now, how big of a sample size would you actually need to be able to say, okay, that's actually a significant finding? Because it drives me nuts when people take things out of context or a tiny little sample size and they want to say, okay, this is everything, not going to work, cast it aside.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. And complicating that further still is that many of the carbon taxes that have been adopted are stunningly low. For example, depending on how you count it, the one in South Africa is about $1.70. In Japan, it's $2. If you're setting carbon taxes that low, you're not really doing it to immediately change behavior. Sweden's carbon tax is now, I'm going to say, roughly around 140, 150 US dollars per ton of CO2. That's enough to seriously change behavior. In Canada, they're trying to work their way up to a serious level. Just take two examples. Most countries have adopted much less ambitious carbon taxes.
Yeah.
And then they're adopting them on a limited range of industries, activities, and gases.
Sure.
And so we just don't have that big, robust sample that we would really like to have to say a carbon tax of this much will reduce emissions this much. We do it indirectly by using, well, okay, so a carbon tax kind of gets at fuel, right? Through the carbon content of the fuel, we know kind of how fuel responds to price changes. Let's use that. And so we do this ex ante modeling, but doing the ex post where we go, this is the effect it did, that's a much, much more difficult thing.
Wow. You know what I just keep thinking about too, and it's going back to I guess a little bit of joke I had at the last time we spoke in public together at the event in Phoenix. I was moderating the panel and I just joked to the crowd that this guy, Dr. Richards, has like this 28-page resume. I'd be here all day if I just read through that. But it got me thinking that you guys have done quite a bit, and you've done a lot, a lot of interesting projects in your professional life, working with the World Bank, IMF, all these other countries. And this is, I guess, putting it out there for everyone to hear. But is there a certain dream project or something that you would ideally love to take on, whether it's economics, whether it's in sustainability? I obviously know you touched that as well.
You know, I'm optimistic we're about to start our dream project, and it's in Indonesia. So Indonesia has a carbon price, but it's not a conventional one. It's not one that's easy to pin down exactly what it is. Uh, and it's a great example of the variety of outcomes that countries are capable of devising. And there is a sense that we can do better, that a simpler, more transparent approach can do better. And we've been approached by ADB and Indonesia to say, would you consider helping us think about, well, where can this carbon pricing instrument go? How shall it evolve? Now, why is that a dream? Well, first of all, because the future is so open on that. So there's lots and lots of opportunities. Second, Indonesia is the fourth most populous country in the world. It is a huge country. Also, in my opinion, one of the most beautiful countries in the world. And the opportunity there to actually have an influence on the direction of a significant economy, an economy that's growing rapidly. They're a major coal exporting country.
Yeah.
And I think they're a country that's really about to come into their own. But they're operating in a stunningly complex political environment.
It sounds kind of familiar.
Yeah. Well, I would say their political environment makes us look like a Sunday school picnic. It's not as rancorous as the American setting, but it's much more siloed. So the various ministries are not doing a wonderful job of coordinating among themselves. It's inherent in the form of government they have. They have a coalition government.
Sure.
We think coalition government means maybe you bring two parties together. There, it means you bring dozens of parties together to form a government. But that makes it harder then to actually control the government from the central position.
Sure.
So it's going to be a wonderful, complex, and frustrating project. But I think it's going to be great. I'm hoping it will have a real positive effect.
I always like talking to you about these topics, not only obviously because it's very informative, but I love the sense of optimism that you always have on this stuff.
Irrational optimism.
I was gonna go there, but I decided not to. Um, couple more things before we finish up. One question for you. Has climate change affected how you do economic modeling at all? And if so, how?
Well, that's a great question. Um, yes, I think it has. Um, so in it's brought together individuals who are not naturally inclined to collaborate. So the first thing is it's brought together engineers and scientists and economists. So I first spotted this issue back in 1994. I was working on the IPCC second state of the art report. And I had the luxury of working on a topic that no one knew anything about. So they just sort of left me alone. And that was forest carbon sequestration economics. Um, but that meant I was in the same group that was working on the cost studies for energy emissions reductions. And it was wonderful watching the battles between the engineers who did what I would call a bottom up study and the economists who are doing top down studies. The bottom up studies are based on technology, costs of energy, capital costs, and so on. And it's based on an assumption that we can adopt whatever the lowest cost technology is, and we will move through those technologies in response to carbon prices.
Huh.
And we'll make these informed executive decisions about which technologies to adopt. The top-down economist models are based on what do we observe people actually doing in response to prices. It's technologically opaque. There is no technology in it. It's just what have we done in the past? We'll continue doing more of that in the future.
Huh.
No room for technological innovation or even adaptation. So these were the two at that point in time in 1994, and watching them battle. So the technologists, the economists, I'm sorry, the engineers and scientists would go, "Oh, we can do a lot for virtually zero cost. In fact, we can save money if we will only do X, Y, and Z. They're all negative cost activities." And the economists would respond, if they're negative costs, why aren't we doing them already? And there sets up the problem. Now, you have the technologically ignorant and the economically ignorant, or you could say, these are the people who really understand technology, and these are the people who really understand behavior. It was something of a shotgun wedding that they were brought together, and the economic models became much over time. They developed hybrids where the economic models were much more technologically sophisticated. MIT runs a marvelously integrated general equilibrium model, one that economists would recognize, but then they inform it with a lot of technological detail that can say, you adopt a carbon price and you'll watch sort of this behavioral response, but this technological response.
I love it. I love it.
So that's the first way in which the modeling has had to adapt. The second is in something called integrated assessment modeling, which is kind of the same theme, but now we have to ask, well, how does the behavior affect the environment, and how does the environment affect the behavior? So if the average temperature goes up by 1.5 degrees centigrade, what's going to happen to health? What does that in turn imply about productivity? And we can start to piece these things together.
Sure.
And so one of the things it's done basically is to force economists to work across disciplines that they may not be entirely comfortable with at the outset.
There's a lot you went over and a lot we went over the last 45 minutes or so. And one of the main points of doing this podcast is to provide open source educational high quality opportunities for those who want to learn more about these topics. A lot of this stuff is pretty complex. Some of the stuff we went through, not as much, but are there any recommendations, possibly something you give your students for spots they can go to learn more about this if they want to, any of these topics, no matter
Yeah.
how far along the process they might actually be?
Yeah. Well, I would suggest a couple of possibilities. I knew you were going to ask this question. So you can't see that, can you?
Nope.
Anyway, it's environmental economics. It's a textbook, just a textbook. I think the best one out there is Charles Colstad. Fantastic introductory, intermediate explanation to how to think about the environment and economics. I'm going to make a personal plug. There's a book that I edited, 2020 Policy Instruments in Environmental Law, part of the Elgar Encyclopedia of Environmental Law. So it's one of the volumes in that encyclopedia set. It covers policy instruments. We've only talked today really about carbon pricing, but there's a vast array of policy instruments that the government has to address climate or environment more broadly. And what we tried to do in this book is give people guidance on that. And then if anyone wanted to explore carbon taxes specifically, there is the Carbon Tax Guide published by the Partnership for Market Readiness in 2017. It's designed to be of use to people at any number of different levels. And then there is a carbon tax online class, asynchronous, so you can take it whenever you want, at the World Bank. Okay. And you get to work through it. It's based on that carbon tax guide, but with narration and exercises and so on. But you can find that at the World Bank's Learning Campus.
Fantastic.
So those would just be a few. I could go on and on, but I'm guessing that you were just looking for a little bit to get started.
No, I appreciate that, and I am going to include everything you just mentioned in the episode notes. So if anyone is interested in following up and following Dr. Richard's suggestions, that information will be available to you. And again, I just want to say thank you very much for taking the time. Every time we chat, now it's been quite a few. You've been very, very informative and gracious with your time, and I always walk out learning more and feeling a little bit smarter on these topics. And so I think that's something we have in common there. So I appreciate that. I want to thank everyone also for listening today. And our next episode 4, will be Professor Raphael Heffron from the University of Oxford and Cambridge, and Abby Watson from Groundwire Strategies, speaking about energy justice, energy transition topics. So with that, thank you very much, Dr. Richards.
Thank you very, very much. I appreciate it. And it's always a pleasure chatting with you. I learn as much as you do, I know. And I'm looking forward to more.